It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. The Saudi monarchy is consolidating power both at home and abroad. On Saturday, dozens of Saudi business figures and royal family members were arrested in what was billed as a sweeping crackdown on corruption. But it's widely seen as a move to entrench the influence of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. Now, this followed the resignation of Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, also apparently at the Saudi kingdom's behest. Hariri says he is stepping down because of an apparent assassination plot against him, and because of what he called the threat of Iran and Hezbollah to Lebanon's stability. But Hariri had just met with Iranian officials and has been pledging to keep working with Hezbollah in a fragile coalition government. So what is really going on? Well, earlier I spoke to Rami Khouri, a professor of journalism at the American University in Beirut and a fellow at Harvard University. Rami Khouri, welcome. Let me start by asking you, do you believe Hariri's explanation when he says that he's resigning because of the threat from Iran and Hezbollah, both to his country and to his own life?
Not completely. I think there are issues that matter to him and cause him discomfort. The challenge of being Lebanese prime minister is really immense. You have to juggle so many internal factions and at the same time direct external interference in the country by many people. Most of it negative pressure and threats and sanctions, including now by the American Congress, new sanctions against dealing with Hezbollah. And this is a really tough job. And I think he found that it was just probably beyond his capacity, and he couldn't reconcile all the different factions that he had to reconcile. And I think it was the Saudis who pushed him to make the resignation. I'm not sure he would have resigned on his own will, as he did just this week. But the Hezbollah and the Iran issues are factors in the life of any prime minister of Lebanon that are difficult to deal with.
What could the Saudis have said to him to exert sufficient pressure to get him to resign?
Probably the main pressure is financial. His financial business empire was in really bad shape in the last 4 or 5 years. Many of the companies that Hariri owned or controlled were not paying salaries. Some of them went bust in Saudi Arabia, like the big construction company, Saudi Oger. And that probably was the main form of pressure that the Saudis could use. The other one simply is to withdraw support for him politically, which would lower his standing inside Lebanon, because one of the most important points in his favor was that he was supported by the Saudis, which often means that the country can expect on getting some financial support, big time financial support. They were talking of $3 to $4 billion a few years ago. The Saudis giving the Lebanese armed forces that kind of support. So it was a combination of political and financial pressure, I think.
Okay, and then so let's get into the reasons why the Saudis would exert this pressure. What do you think is their goal here?
Well, anything that anybody tells you about Saudi Arabia, including myself, is speculation. Saudi Arabia is like the Kremlin in the 1960s. We don't really know the inner workings of their decision-making government system and the royal family. But my own assessment is that the Saudis, first of all, have had a pretty ineffective foreign policy across the Middle East. Broadly speaking, they've been not very effective, and in some cases incompetent, and in some cases counterproductive. For instance, the war in Yemen, the boycott and sanctions of Qatar, the supporting the opposition to overthrow the government in Syria, and now in Lebanon, they haven't really succeeded in any of their policies regionally, and some of them have backfired, so that if they are trying to weaken Iran's regional links with Arab countries or groups, the exact opposite has happened, including now in Yemen, where the Iranians are more involved with the Houthis than they were 3 years ago when the war started. So I think it's a desperate, frantic search by the new leadership of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince who is effectively running the country. It's a desperate search to do two things: to show their power and assert their resolute insistence on using their power to achieve goals that would serve the national interest of Saudi Arabia, and send a message to everybody around the region and the world that Saudi Arabia is tough, it has assets to use, it has power, it will use that power unilaterally, even to make war if need be, and it will take charge of protecting its national interest. This is how the Saudis see it. They see their national interest as threatened by many trends in the region, including democracy breaking out in some countries, mass political activism, protests that overthrew some regimes, Muslim Brothers coming to power legitimately as they did in Egypt, the Americans and others signing agreements with Iran. All of these things scare the Saudis and the Emiratis and some other conservative Arab leaders. And the Saudis have been saying for a few years they're not going to just sit around and quake and ask somebody to help them. They're going to now use their power to protect themselves. And Lebanon is one example of this, where they see Hezbollah's power in Lebanon, which is quite considerable. They see Hezbollah as an extension of Iran, and they don't like Iran, and they think Iran is a threat, and they feel that if they can whittle down Hezbollah's power in Lebanon, they might be able to weaken Iran's strategic depth across the Middle East. I personally think that this is fantasy. I think the Iranians are not necessarily hegemonic powers that want to control the Middle East, because they know they can't. They're an Iranian Shiite power. The Middle East is Arab and mostly Sunni Muslim. But the Saudis do really genuinely perceive a threat from Iran, and they think that by whittling down the power of Hezbollah in Lebanon, they might weaken Iran. But the exact opposite has happened in the last 3 or 4 years of the Saudis or anybody else trying, the Americans over the last 10, 15 years, that Hezbollah has gotten stronger and Iran has gotten stronger across the region in the last 15, 20 years. So I think we can understand what the Saudis are doing. I think it's hard to understand why they think this strategy is going to work when they've had a series of failures using this approach. But this is probably due to lack of experience, especially with Mohammed bin Salman, the new crown prince, who's going to be king very soon. He has zero experience in statecraft, and the people around him don't have much experience either. And I think we're seeing that because the several policies he's already tried in Syria and Qatar and Yemen, and the internal reforms in Saudi Arabia, most of them have failed. And this is a problem for the Saudis. They need to address this very quickly.
Speaking of internal reforms in Saudi Arabia, MBS, who you mentioned, has just ordered the arrests of members of the royal family, as well as a bunch of former ministers, on corruption allegations, he says. Some really powerful people. What do you think is going on there, and does it tie into this resignation of Hariri?
Maybe. We really don't know. Most analysts and people who know Saudi Arabia that I've read and talked to in the last few days don't believe this is really about corruption. Because if you're going to hit corruption and reduce it in Saudi Arabia, you're going to have to tackle the really critical and very delicate issue of where is the line between the public wealth of the state, the government, and the country, and the private wealth of members of the royal family, thousands of them, who get immense amounts of money either through their monthly allocations or through having business monopolies or business interests that are given to them by the state, which make them incredibly wealthy. And there's no sign that that's going to happen anytime soon. So we're going to have to wait a few weeks to really understand better what this is all about. It's maybe more a sign that Mohammed bin Salman wants to send to everybody in Saudi Arabia, the media, the business community, the royal family, technocrats, everybody in the country, that he's in charge. And if anybody opposes him or even just questions or discusses what he's doing, they're going to end up with this same fate. They'll be detained, their bank accounts will be frozen, and they can be accused of corruption. Now, you have in the Arab world two basic accusations that governments make against anybody they don't like. They say that they're involved in terrorism or that they're involved in corruption, and they define those things loosely the way they want the governments do, and therefore they just do anything they want to detain people, strip them of their money if they and their positions, humiliate them, sometimes put them in jail. And this is a way to intimidate other people in society. It's not clear yet in Saudi Arabia where is the actual middle ground of what Mohammed bin Salman is doing. Are the corruption accusations just a fig leaf for a power grab that he's doing? Is he trying to eliminate every possible source of not only opposition, but even independent wealth and power in the country so that nobody can stand in his way to remake Saudi Arabia in the image that he wants to remake it? Or is this genuinely the beginning of a move to fight corruption by starting with the wealthiest people, setting an example possibly, and then moving on to other people? But I really don't know. I don't think anybody knows, but it's one of those two things.
Right. Okay. So back to Lebanon. So now a new coalition government has to be formed under Lebanon's complex rules that allow for equal representation for the three main ethnic communities in Lebanon. What do you expect to happen with that? And let me also ask you, you mentioned earlier that Hezbollah strength has grown in recent years. Do you think that ahead of the general election in Lebanon next year, that this move will strengthen them even more?
Maybe, yeah. I'm generally hesitant to predict the future, especially in the Arab world. But what's clear is that Hezbollah over the last 15 years or so has significantly increased both its military power and its political standing within the country, within Lebanon. So, for instance, Hezbollah now is closely allied to the president, Michel Aoun, and therefore has, unusually strong capacities to influence policies. They can block anything in the country that they don't like through the constitutional parliamentary system or through the cabinet. And so if they pursue policies that are seen by a majority of Lebanese to be useful to the state and improve people's lives, then yes, they will keep growing in power. If they're seen to be destructive and creating problems and chaos and violence and warfare, then they will drop in popularity. In the final analysis, they cannot impose themselves by force on the Lebanese people. They might try that one day, but they would certainly get a lot of resistance if they did. So they have to play the political game, which they've done reasonably well so far, but they've done it from a position of immense strength because they're critical for the consensus policy making that is applied in Lebanon. And they're also absolutely critical for the national security of the country. They've worked very closely with their own forces and the police and the intelligence to beat back the wave of threats coming from Islamist radicals, from Islamic State or Tahrir al-Sham or the Al-Qaeda guys in Syria and Salafi groups like that. And they are very, very important militarily and now politically as well. And whether they grow in strength or drop in strength is going to depend a lot on how they perform, how they use their power, and how the opposition performs. If the opposition remains splintered as it is now, their coalition with Michel Aoun, the president, who has the biggest group of Christian politicians or political forces in the country, if that coalition will dominate everything in Lebanon for years to come, if the opposition remains splintered. And one of the problems Hariri had was that he was gradually overseeing the fracturing of the Sunni. The integrity of the Sunni community in Lebanon was fracturing into smaller and smaller groups, and Sunnis, many were opposing him and challenging him, mainly because they saw him as an ineffective leader. And that's possibly one of the reasons that he was brought down. It's possible that Saudis might have seen that he was not able to revive and unite the Sunnis in Lebanon, which would have been an important political gain for Saudi Arabia in countering or checking Hezbollah. So maybe they felt that it's time to find somebody else, but that's not easy to do, and this is the challenge that the President Michel Aoun has now.
We'll leave it there. Rami Khouri, professor of journalism at the American University of Beirut, also a senior non-resident fellow at Harvard University. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.